You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you another episode from the Encore series, where we revisit past museum programs and conversations. This is part 2 of Investigating OJ Simpson, the Case for DNA. In part 1, we heard from our panelists who come from different sides of the case's investigation. From Detective Tom Lang, Rockne Harmon, Deputy District Attorney assisting LAPD, and Dr. Jennifer Smith, an FBI DNA analyst. In part 2, we will hear from our panelists as they converse in greater detail not only about their individual experiences in the case, but also how the use of DNA evidence in the OJ Simpson case has affected the way we use DNA evidence today, and what we have learned about presenting DNA evidence to juries nearly 30 years after this trial. Stick around for the conclusion of this riveting discussion in part 2 of Investigating OJ Simpson, the Case for DNA.
So, Rock, early on, you tried to head off trouble when you filed a motion against the defense team's plan to have a Nobel laureate testify in court.
I knew you would find that.
whose job it would be to confuse that jury about the reliability of DNA evidence. Tell me about that piece of the puzzle.
About my challenge?
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any lawyers? Well, this is being recorded. That's fine. My lawyer is sitting in the back. It's funny you should ask that. If you want to read how effective I was at getting in the head of a Nobel Prize winner, read his book, Dancing in the Minefield. There's a whole chapter about me in there. So I failed high school chemistry. I had to go to summer school one summer. No, it was, God, you're bringing up so many strange memories. This is a bizarre experience. I mean, when I saw Tom testify for 11 days, right? Wasn't that what you were understanding?
It's only 8.5. But
Eight and a half. I thought, you know what? Not that he didn't do things, but normally when you're the investigator, you're the glue that holds it together. Most of the stuff other people are going to testify about. I realized I was in a different world. And the world down there was just put it on paper, file a motion, let people read it, have fun with it. The judge would never stop you from talking about anything, even though it was all in your papers. So we had I filed a motion saying, I want to be able to cross-examine this Nobel Prize winner, the guy who invented the technology, the newer technology, Kerry Mullis, about how proud he is to consume LSD. And I had stacks of videotapes of him accepting awards at prestigious organizations and talking about the fractal patterns, watching the sun come through the curtains up in his room that afternoon. So it's not that it wasn't true, but I wanted to ask him, have you taken LSD today? Just because that's something you could ask a drug addict or a prostitute if they're testifying. So Nobel Prize winners are no exception to that. And then the other part of it was trying to develop his anti-law enforcement personality, did his arrest and conviction for beating up his girlfriend. So, and there it was all over the front page of every newspaper in the country, knowing two things. One, they were never going to call him because he might have taken LSD that day, and they didn't need him, and they really didn't need him. So there was a very bizarre aspect underneath everything that was going on to the trial. So when Jennifer gave me access to those, I was looking for those moments in the tape that were surreal. And this is my favorite. When I give an OJ talk, it's part of the argument because I don't know if you saw it, when we argued and the judge agreed with me, I made the comment, oh, well, if we just want to shortcut this, they should just put him in detox for a few days so he can't drop acid before he testified. So that was on the front page of the paper, too. But no, I think it was reflective of how bizarre everything became. Arguments went for hours and hours while the judge sat there and just let everybody talk. It's not the way things were in Alameda County, I can promise you that.
Detective Lang, your partner, Detective Van Adder, had more or less handpicked Marcia Clark to lead the prosecution team because he had worked with her successfully on DNA cases before. As I understand it, some friction developed between the investigative team and the prosecution's team. You talked about lack of communication and missteps. Tell us about the process. Because you, as an investigator, you gather all this evidence, you've got your DNA guy to go through it and analyze it, but it's the prosecutors, including Rock, who present it in the courtroom. What were the problems as you perceived them going forward?
I agree with Rock. Bizarre. That's a really good word.
Yeah.
Kind of describes it all. Phil had a good relationship with Marcia. In fact, they convicted the first no-body DNA case in the state of California. And Marcia was a very intelligent woman. She was a good prosecutor. But I had had a previous problem with her in a previous case involving a murder for hire. It took 8 years to put this case together, believe it or not. Sometimes these cases take a long time. That's why they have our unit. This one, there were a couple of people's lives in danger. And I'd set this case up, and she was going to be the prosecutor, and she went around with me in interviews. We had everything ready to go. Again, it's 8 years old. We have a person who's going to roll over on the suspect. The suspect's a hired killer, total sociopath. We even had him under surveillance at one point. At the last minute, she decides, for whatever reason, and she decided not to prosecute. She pulls the rug out. She doesn't tell me. She tells Phil, tell Tom, I'm not going to handle this case. Well, she's not only jeopardized the case, but the lives of one of the witnesses. I was furious. 3 months later, we end up with this thing. I haven't talked to her since. The case gets dropped. Bad deal all around. Then this thing goes down. Once we got to Bundy, the officers with Thurman found the glove. It becomes a crime scene. So they had to secure that scene, get more people there, another criminalist involved, and a search warrant. So I've lost Phil. Now he's got Rockingham, and I've got Bundy by myself. Go back to Bundy, and I start ordering people in, start processing the crime scene, getting evidence set up, the whole 9 yards. It's a very long process. Phil comes by, and I don't know this. I don't know that. I know that the glove has been found, but I don't know that other evidence has been found because the sun came up, and there's blood tailing from the rear of the Bronco through the Rockingham gate, right up the driveway, right into the house, and right up to Simpson's bedroom where we have a bloody pair of socks with RFLP testing. Nicole's blood, no question, it's her blood type of thing. So he's got his hands full, but he's got to write a warrant at this point. He can't go any further. And he tells me, I need a DA. And so I said, okay, I'll do the warrant, and I'll be here for a while. He says, I'm going to get Marcia. And, it didn't hit me right. I didn't want Marcia for those reasons, because this is a personal thing. I'm not going to badmouth her because she's not here to defend herself, but I had a lot of problems with her. I didn't want her there. We're under the gun at this point. The media has started to show up. They've set up across the street. There's about a dozen cameras. They're in a little knoll, which is exactly 115 feet east of the bodies. And they're going to start taping our crime scene. They're going to tape our evidence. You're going to see it on the 6 o'clock news. You're going to see the bodies with your evidence. All this stuff, a lot of things are going on. But we needed to have a DA now because we needed a warrant now. Things are happening that quickly. So I related and said, fine, go right ahead. Now, your question, normally we don't pick the DAs. That's not up to us. If we know someone who we have confidence in, who we've worked in the past successfully, you may want to call and see if they're available and see what they think. But that goes through the DA. That goes through their supervisor. Now, Marcia was very competent, very intelligent, very good prosecutor in her own right. We had lots of problems on these cases. Some of us did. You can't think about that. That gets pushed aside. So now we've got her and you go with her.
Mhm.
But no, we do not normally pick the prosecutor. That's up to the DA. But Marcia was in and the rest is, as they say, history.
And Rock, tell us about your position. So you've got the DNA evidence, and you know that's going to fit into the prosecution. And as you say, you've got so much. I mean, this could be an evidentiary, prosecution. But tell us about your role in that process, and did your voice enter into the prosecution's plan to take the case to trial the way they would?
You had to put the way they would on the end there.
Well, it's a bizarre case.
Yeah. We were very compartmentalized. I know Tom and I, and to the point that, I'm going to share some things here that are kind of fun, but they're not, they didn't make the TV series. The first time we were ever going to really talk as a group, it got canceled because Annie Leibovitz was there. I didn't see you bare-chested in the Annie Leibovitz spread in Vanity Fair, so we didn't make the spread, but that's the kind of stuff that preempted the normal course of business, and it was very disappointing to see all of this stuff there, and people not taking advantage of all the help and everything that was going on. There's one point I really want to make that shows you how concerned the LAPD was, probably because it was OJ Simpson, of not making a mistake about where they were going to go within hours of when he came back from LA, and they got a sample from him, a young criminalist in LAPD. They were only doing the PCR testing that was available. It wasn't very informative, but they analyzed several of the drops along the walkway. Tom described to you why they were really critical. And while it didn't give you a home run answer, if it wasn't going to be from the guy whose sample you had, it was going to jump out at you. So within 36 hours, you guys knew. I was home watching television at the time in Northern California, but they knew, and this was rushed through, and this was probably, of all the stuff that was developed, it was the most critical moment, because if that's not his blood, you're looking for the real guy at that point. So the rush was to find the truth, regardless of who it pointed to, not to find him. But no, the challenge, we were very compartmentalized. You had an evidence collection prosecutor, Hank. You had a pathology guy, Kelberg, and I probably learned a lot from listening to Tom's thing, because I didn't get down there till November as the trial jury selection is going on. So it became critical, to coordinate and make sure it fit, if it really did. I think the most interesting part of all of the results that you see, there was no stray DNA and there was a lot of stuff tested. There was nothing that couldn't have been from one victim, the other victim, and OJ, or different combinations of them. And the combinations were reflective of what was happening, like in his car on the passenger side of the console was stuff that was consistent with all three of them or two of them, depending on which one you got. So I heard some people, it sounded like some reaction when you heard that Nicole's blood was on the sock. Without a doubt, it was her blood, to the exclusion of anybody that ever lived. Now, you probably wonder, and someone will probably have great questions about, well, what happened? That's a whole other story, but there's an answer to that.
Dr. Smith, I mentioned earlier that you testified in hundreds of trials. When you are testifying about DNA evidence, what are a couple of the do's and don'ts? What are the things you have to do, and what are the things you have to avoid?
So pre-OJ, we actually walked a jury through how the process worked. Because in the RFLP process, often at some point in time, we would put the results up in front of the jury, and you may have seen different depictions. They kind of almost look like a little X-ray film, and they've got bands on them. And sometimes we would actually produce those. And I guess we had in our head sort of this hope that the jury would have an aha moment and see it the way we saw it, right? That was your hope, that autorad, they were called, would speak for itself. So prior to this, part of my training before I hit the road as a trained examiner to testify was I actually went to, here in DC, I went down to American University and got a biology class together at night and asked a professor if I could borrow her students. And I presented my testimony, my direct testimony, not about kind of who I was, but actually the technology. And then I handed out a little test at the end. Now, these are biology students, and said, answer these questions. And when I got the results back, I realized they weren't really following me. So all my great technical knowledge I was sharing with them wasn't really landing, so to speak. And so that's when I started thinking, this might not be the best way to go. And then sort of the OJ trial came along, and we actually had some documentation that maybe that wasn't the best way to do it. Maybe we should do more like the forensic chemists. Forensic chemists get on and say, I'm a chemist, I have this great piece of equipment, and this is cocaine. And you can trust me on that. And they get off the stand, and everybody's going, yeah, that's cocaine. Look at that guy. He's got a bow tie on. I believe him, And so after sort of the OJ, we had this gathering of thought amongst the community and said, maybe we need to keep it simple. And we're just going to get on, and we're going to talk about how qualified we are and how our labs work, and we're proficiency tested. And I have looked at these results, and by and large, it's DNA, and it's consistent with this individual to reasonable, whatever the stats were, right? So we started taking that approach. And by and large, I think that's usually the approach we do now, a more directed, if we're in the trial. Now, if we have to go through an admissibility hearing, it's like back to school for everybody there, including the judge. I mean, if I'm trying to prove I know that this works in the admissibility phase prior to trial, I'm going to do all my PhD stuff, right? But in trials, we took a more simple approach. Now, I'll tell you a funny story. It was actually in California, post-OJ decision. I'm in a California courtroom, and I give my little short dog and pony show, get off the stand, getting ready to head back to Washington. It's like an hour later, and I actually get called back by the prosecutor saying the jury's got a question. They want to know more about the DNA. Because they'd been the audience watching the OJ stuff. They'd been the ones getting the play-by-plays, right? So they wanted to know more, right? So occasionally you have to find this balance, but I think by and large became the approach of us explaining to a certain degree how reliable the science was and things like that. Because what was fascinating about this, as I said, they were attacking a little bit of the technology. You actually had admissibility hearings, right? Or you didn't have one, but they were trying to push for those. And then ultimately they sort of decided, we're not going to try to keep the DNA out. Right, we're going to let the jury see the DNA, and then we're going to, kind of go down that path and maybe attack the process a little bit. At that time, I believe they used the 1992 NRC report. And so there was a report that had come out by the National Academy of Science in 1992, and it had poked some holes in DNA. It just kind of put it out there. And we used to all carry our little reports around with us with little yellow stickies, and there'd be some comments that usually defense would bring up. And then we'd highlight, yes, but you need to also read on page 42 where it says how great it is, right? So some of those elements were brought out in some of the witnesses. And I think that's why a guy like Rock was there, because Rock had tried DNA cases before. So he sort of knew going into it maybe some of the areas they might be attacking, and so he could prep the witnesses for those. So it was very much in the 90s, in this place and time, as I said before, a really fascinating almost decision and struggle as to how to convey what we could see as scientists when we got these results back.
In the meantime, Detective Lang had another problem, and that was the integrity of the actions of one of your officers. You mentioned him already, Mark Furman, who had made statements that made it easy for the media and others to paint him as a racist and cast a shadow over the integrity of the evidence he had handled. How did you handle that as lead investigator?
Not well. To begin with, we hadn't met Mark Furman. We knew nothing about his past. Mark Furman was never a homicide detective. He's assisted at a couple. He's a bright guy. We first met him. We went over to Rockingham, and he did a good job in following up after an interview with Cato Kalin, following up on these noises that Kalin had heard on his wall thinking there was an earthquake. He went back and he found the right-hand glove. He did not plant evidence. He did not plant the glove. Nobody planted evidence in this case. That is a lie that has continued to be perpetuated by defense attorneys on this case to this day. And involving my partner, they waited till he died, and then they said, by the way, he's been planting evidence. I get really upset when we talk about that, but this is another story. Furman did a good job at the scene in Rockingham. He found the glove, he interviewed, did good follow-up work. Later on, the defense hired everybody, and they started digging into us. I had people that came to my city and tried to do background on me. In fact, I caught one of them one day down the street from my house. And they're trying to, where do I live? Let's talk to neighbors. They went after everybody, and Furman was one of them because he was at the scene and found the glove, which was the initial link between the two locations. Unbeknownst to everyone, he was apparently collaborating with a writer and making this script that he says he was talking to her about that involved the LAPD, brutalizing people, racism, profanity, racist remarks, and he's very graphic in describing these things to the writer. Now, when all of this became known, there was obviously a very deep internal investigation. None of that stuff ever happened.
Did he know he was being recorded when he talked to that writer?
My information is yes.
Okay. I never knew that. Yeah.
Well, I was just about to say that.
Yeah.
Why in hell would you be recorded? True or not, it doesn't matter. When someone gets a hold of that and you're a cop, this, of course, is during the case. So his supervisor finds out that he's making these remarks to this woman, this writer, and he orders him, cease, don't do it anymore. This is not going to make us look good. Well, he doesn't listen to his supervisor. He continues to make more remarks, knowing they're being recorded the second time. Okay, so anyhow, they dig this out. This stuff comes out, and let me put it out there. This is not relevant to this case. This is a peripheral issue involving someone who has racist tendencies, who doesn't tell the truth, a bad cop, okay? But that had nothing to do with the evidence in this case and should not have gone into evidence. It's as simple as that. But when he gets braced and now everything turns and Furman is standing there with his pants down around his ankles going like this, everybody gets concerned and everything comes out. They admit two of the tapes. It goes out. The end is Furman on the stand with his lawyer standing next to him, and he has asked Detective Furman, have you ever planted evidence in this case or any other case? And he pleads the fifth. Case was over. It implodes. Forget it. Let's go home. That's the problem with all of that. But that never should have come in.
Rock, what should that bloody glove have conveyed to the jury, and what role should it have played in that trial?
It's a great question, and I try not to be too complicated because I think if I polled any of you who think you have any ideas about what the evidence means, and your questions, it would be a good time to do it. Say, well, what do you think was planted, and what do you think was contaminated? And you'll realize that everybody's got a different perception of what they think happened, but even more importantly, what the defense really did. Now, Tom's finishing point there is critical. When a jury makes a decision, they don't have to agree on why they make that decision. They just agree whether it's proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So one person can be persuaded by that, 5 can be persuaded by contamination, 6 can say planting. So in reality, I'm going to go back to this is the Furman glove that we're talking about, the one at Rockingham. The way the evidence was presented was that the glove was planted but that OJ's blood didn't get on there until this young criminalist, within 24 hours of OJ coming back from Chicago, that when he took some of the reference sample to type it along with the evidence, that the first thing he did was, depending on whose book you read, it was a deluge. The stuff was dripping off the ceiling because it exploded up there. And the testimony is boring. I got a little bit on the paper and I changed my gloves. It's routine because there's so much DNA in a tube of blood. And the first item, what was the first item that he then processed after that at a different place, changing gloves, was the glove. And then the next items were the blood drops along there. So depending on which version you want to read or which book you read, there was the real killer's blood was there. This is hard. This is like a Chinese menu. No offense intended with all the different combinations on there. Parts were planted, parts were contaminated. But the theory that the jury heard, the evidence was, they collected the blood. It was a hot day. It sat in the van, and the heat caused the true killer's blood to disappear. This is what the jury heard. This is not my opinion about what they heard. This is what they heard. So, and then in the deluge, when Yamauchi popped the tube there and changed his gloves, he was just transferring it to those blood drops down the line. But I read something else that Van Adder also had access to those little swatches, and maybe he took the tube that he had from OJ and planted the blood on those swatches and then substituted them somehow in the property room before
Phil was a
Colin got it.
magician. People don't realize that.
That's a different book.
Yeah.
But I mean, so but no, the glove had great. It was the mate to the other one. It had the victim's blood. So you got Furman planting the OJ bloodless glove over there. Why would he do that? He must have been brilliant to know that OJ really did it at that time. That would pretty risky behavior, even for a racist cop.
Well, that's bad enough, but when people actually believe that.
No, I agree.
That's even worse.
But to be fair, the last acquittal I had, and you remember, you don't have that many of them because juries usually do the right thing. It's when the jury didn't care.
Yeah.
And when they have to sit through all the stuff that Jennifer described, and they've got a guy who you can seem to make a key to it, it's like deflating a balloon at that point. And that's just not an excuse. But when you can't, trying to get a jury to care about convicting a hero for killing his wife after something like that happens is pretty hard to do, regardless of the evidence. It's just easy to say, I don't believe any of this stuff. So
I do want to open it up to your questions. Do we have microphones for the audience when they ask their questions, or should they just project? You can project, and I'm going to need a hand to let you know. But first, I want to ask Dr. Smith one final question. Performance counts in a courtroom. It is part theater. I mean, that's the system. And typically, you're not going to have a lot of scientists in that jury box. Is it always going to be an uphill battle for science to come in and have the impact that the facts the prosecution feels should have, or sometimes the defense, quite clearly, because the science is neutral. But whichever way it comes out, the other side is going to be speaking a different language, one that the jury is more familiar with.
So, part of my, profession is to be scientists that can explain our science. We're called forensic scientists for a reason. We know that when we do our science, we are going to have to take it to someone who needs to make a decision. So in a traditional forensic science lab, you're doing your science to help some investigator go forward, perhaps with a case, or perhaps let someone go. So our job is to know our science, but also be able to convey it. and what the meaning of that is. So that's our job. And so, that was part of going through this trial and looking at that. I would actually take the testimony, the live testimony of some of the forensic scientists, and show it to my students and say, all right, as you're watching this individual explain, do you have confidence in them? There was one individual who you could tell was so nervous that when they were asked a very simple question, what does a criminalist do? They sort of actually stuttered and stammered through, and that would have been what we call a softball question, right? And this individual, you could see, had not spent a lot of time practicing. And we have to practice. So to your point, it is sort of performance because you have to not be nervous. You have to convey confidence. And you need to practice that. So that was the message to the students. Because if you think about it, most of us are uncomfortable when we have to speak in front of a bunch of people, right? Imagine when you now have to speak about technical things, right? In a way that I actually think jurors are as savvy as they've ever been, right? And people can talk about the CSI effect and all that kind of stuff. I actually believe that CSI helps keep people engaged and involved. They know it's television, and our job is to go in there and explain science. And science, is understandable to people, but we have to be on our game. And so I would talk, and there's a classic, Dr. Bruce Weir was a statistician from New Zealand, brilliant guy, brilliant. But he really struggled with his testimony because he made a mistake. And he got caught. It was actually a true Perry Mason moment when the defense found a mistake in his report. Now, this individual is very confident. He's a full professor, brilliant guy, and he has now been caught on the witness stand, but he wasn't trained as a forensic scientist. Can you imagine? He's caught in front of everything, and he's made a mistake, and it really had an effect on him. Right? Those are the things we train about, and if you're good going in and you've got all your things, hopefully they won't catch you in mistakes, but if they do. So a big part of our job is to be able to convey that science in such a way, with the confidence that people, because what's a juror, the poor juror just has to assess whether that person's telling the truth or not, whether they know what they're talking about. And so that's what we make sure we try to do in our job. So to me, it's a big part of being a forensic scientist. So.
Let me read your quote from the LA Times, January 23rd, 2012. In a book Manatter wrote with his partner Tom Lang, the two detectives credited, quote, a brilliantly pragmatic legal defense team for using a handful of police errors and the racist views of one rogue detective to cause our mountain of evidence to melt down like a cup of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Detective Tom Lang, Rock Harmon, Dr. Jennifer Smith, thank you so much for your insights onto this case. Thank you for coming tonight. I think we may be talking about it 20 years from now still.
I hope I'm able to, yeah.
It's no question that the OJ Simpson trial continues to be a touchstone in America's fascination with true crime and the real-life practice of law enforcement. In the discussion we just heard, it is easy to see that this case played a key role in shaping the careers of our panelists beyond 1995. Their reflection on that experience and how it has affected our justice system as a whole was truly insightful. We hope that you enjoyed looking back at this program, investigating OJ Simpson, the case for DNA. And as always, thanks to Anna Muckenfoos, our Manager of Programs and Education Initiatives, for helping write today's program, and Christopher Mitchell, our Manager of Digital Content and Strategy, for producing. If you enjoyed this Encore program on the OJ Simpson trial, be sure to check out another of our podcast shows called Law and Disorder, where Anna will bring you a look at the world of true crime. She's got her own angle on the OJ trial, and will do a deep dive into the lasting effects of the trial on law enforcement in the United States. Thank you for listening to this episode of Encore, a Precinct 444 podcast from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Join us next time for another look back at some of our best programs from the past. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. And we would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to Precinct444 at NLEOMS.com. lnf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.